Section 7.2, weighted voting. In 7.1, we introduced some terminology and approaches to voting. And in all of those approaches to voting, even the board account where it had different points attached to the rankings, the players or the voters in all of those different scenarios that we looked at got one vote. And their vote was equal to everybody else's. Everybody else got one vote too. So what we're going to see here in 7.2, this idea of weighted voting, different voters are going to have more power. They're going to essentially have votes that count for more. It'd be like one person getting to vote and having 10 votes worth go in, or more or less, but they're going to have more than one vote oftentimes in the weighted voting system. So we're going to look at some of the terminology with that, the concept of weighted voting, and then we're going to look at two different power indexes for players, the Banzhaf and the Shapley-Shubik. And I'll give us an idea of who has voting power based on this weighted voting concept. Weighted voting overall, in certain voting situations, the voters may have unequal voting power. Examples of this include stock shareholder votes, where some people own more shares than others. If you're looking at a certain owner of a company, sometimes when they go public, they retain 51% of the shares. Well, they're going to have 51% of the vote controlled at any shareholder voting meeting. So, they basically control what happens. So that'd be one example. And then the Electoral College, for the United States, the electoral voting system. The states have different amounts of electoral votes based on the population. That's a weighted voting system. Every state is not the same. They don't have the same amount of votes in the Electoral College. So just two examples that you might see in the U.S., and there are others, but those are some of the more common ones. Getting into the terminology here, players. These are just individuals or entities that vote. And the notation, you're going to see like subscripts. So player 1, player 2, go all the way out to player sub capital N, where that capital N is the total number of players. So if there are 30 players, you'd have P sub 1, P sub 2, P sub 3, all the way up, P sub 29, then P sub 30. And each of those subscripts just tells you the player number. The weight is going to be the number of votes controlled by a player. And use the notation here, W sub I is the general, but the subscript is going to match the player. So, for example, W2 would be for player 2, and etc. The quota, this is the minimum number of votes needed to pass a measure. So you have to have a certain amount in order for a vote, or I should say a measure, to pass. And the quota must be over half the total weights. Basically that means that you have to have a majority and cannot be more than the total weight. This should make sense, because if you had a quota that was more than everybody's weights added together, you would never pass anything. If you added up all the weights and you had 100, and then the quota was 101, you would never meet that quota. Even if everybody got together and voted unanimously, you wouldn't make that quota. So the quota has to be at the most equal to the total weight. And if it's more than that, it's not a valid voting system. So you have to have the majority, and then you can't be more than the total weight. And the notation for quota is just Q. And the overall notation for a weighted voting system, they use a square bracket to start it out, and then they put the quota first. So they let you know the quota first, then they put a colon, and then in order they give you the weights for each of the players that are in play. And then they close that off. So you have a quota, colon, and then all the weights. So let's take a look at an example here. I want to consider the weighted voting system 157631. So this tells me Q here, weight 1, weight 2, weight 3, and weight 4. And how many players are there? Well, there were 4 weights, so there's 4 players. The weight of each player is just that 7, 6, 3, 1. The quota is the first number in the brackets, so that's the 15. And is this a valid system? Why or why not? So we need to check 2 things. You check your quota to make sure it's good. So what we're going to check here is that half the total weight is less than the quota. The quota has to be more than that. And at the same time, the quota has to be less than or equal to the total weight. If we look at this one first, the half the total weight, I need to get the total weight. And the total weight is just adding together all of the player weights. So our total equals 7 plus 6 plus 3 plus 1. That's going to end up equaling 17. And then we're going to find the majority there. So to do this, we're going to take 17 divided by 2. That's going to give us 8.5. And the quota itself was 15. So 15 is greater than that 8.5, or the 8.5 is less than the quota. So this part checks out, that half checks out. And then I'm going to move over and look at this one. Is the quota less than or equal to the total weight? Well, the quota is 15. Is that less than or equal to 17? And we found the total weight already in that first part. And that checks out. 15 is less than or equal to 17. So in this case, this is a valid system. Both the quota conditions hold. You always check the quota conditions when they ask if it's valid. Oops. See if I can spell valid. So because quota conditions are satisfied. I'm having trouble spelling today. All right. So yes, valid, those 2 quota conditions. And that's all you got to do. Get half your total weight, make sure the quota is more than that, and then make sure it's also less than or equal to the total. All right, so let's take a look here at some other terms to be aware of in these weighted voting systems. You have a dictator. This is a player who can pass any motion alone. They don't need anyone else there. They have enough weight to meet the quota without anyone else. Veto power. This is a player who can stop a motion from passing. When you have a dictator, nobody will have veto power, and if you have veto power for somebody, then you won't have a dictator. So you're either going to have one or the other. You're going to have like a dictator, or you're going to have some people with veto power potentially. You may not have anyone with veto power even when there's no dictator, but you definitely don't have those first 2 together in any given voting system. And then a dummy, it's just a player who has no power. They will never be critical or pivotal in passing a motion. And we'll see as we get down into the power indexes, if they don't have any power, it'll be 0 power, and then that'll indicate that they're a dummy. So a couple more examples here. You may want to try these on your own. Example 2, consider the weighted voting system 13, 15, 7, 4, 3. Is any player a dictator? Well, here's my quota, and then here's weight 1. And weight 1 is more than the quota. Yes, player 1 is a dictator. They can pass any motion alone. Okay, and then this next one here, weighted voting system. Does any player have veto power? Are any players a dummy? Explain. Well, player 1 does have veto power. If player 1 sits out, the other 3 players together cannot pass a motion. And player 1 isn't a dictator. They don't have the power to meet the quota, without any help. But if they sit out, nothing passes. So player 1 does have veto power. Nothing passes without them. And for the dummies, in this case, you're looking to see if any of the players have 0 power, 0 effect. And all of the players actually have some power here. Player 1 for sure, they got veto power, they're no dummy. Player 2, if they join with player 1, they can pass a motion, so they have some power. Players 3 and 4, if they join together and then join with player 1, even if player 2 sits out, they will just barely make the quota. 12 plus 3 plus 1 is 16. And that means that even player 4 with their 1 vote has some power, because they would be critical to passing a motion if player 2 sat out. So there are no dummies. All players have power. And we'll see again, as I said earlier, when we get into the power indices and actual numbers that go with those, you'll be able to determine if they have power by looking at their power index value. And we'll see that here shortly. And I'm going to go ahead and just wait till the next video to get into Banzhaf and Shapley-Shubuck.